The courtroom felt colder than it should have, even with the late afternoon sun slipping through the tall windows and casting long golden streaks across the polished wooden floor. People sat in quiet rows, whispering occasionally, their voices low but curious. Cases like this were common: another marriage ending, another pair of lives splitting into separate paths, but there was something about this one that drew attention. Maybe it was the way the man sat so confidently, almost lazily, in his chair. Or perhaps it was the way the woman across from him held herself together, as if every breath required effort. He leaned back, one arm resting casually over the back of his chair, his lips curled into a faint smirk that never quite faded. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had already won. His expensive suit fit him perfectly, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady and unbothered. Every now and then, he glanced toward her, as if expecting her to look back, but she didn't. She kept her eyes fixed on the papers in front of her, her fingers trembling just slightly as she held the pen. The silence between them spoke louder than any argument ever could. Just a few years ago, they had stood together in a very different place, smiling, hopeful, surrounded by friends and family who believed in their love. Back then, he had promised forever with the same confidence he now carried into this courtroom. And she had believed him, wholeheartedly, without hesitation. She had built her life around those promises, trusting that they were real, that they meant something. But promises, she had learned, could be as fragile as glass. "Go ahead," he said quietly, his voice smooth, almost bored. "Let's not drag this out any longer." His words cut through the silence like a blade. A few heads turned. Even the clerk paused for a moment before returning to her paperwork. The woman swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the pen. She didn't look up at him, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing the pain in her eyes. Instead, she focused on the page, the final page, the one that would officially end everything. Her lawyer leaned in slightly, whispering something reassuring, but the words barely registered. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, echoing in her ears. Across from her, he shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers lightly against the armrest. Impatient. Always impatient. That had been one of the first cracks in their marriage, though she hadn't realized it at the time. He wanted things quickly, easily, without resistance. And when life didn't give him that, he found ways to take control. The judge, seated at the front of the room, watched quietly. His expression was neutral, practiced, but his eyes moved carefully between the two of them, observing every detail. He had seen countless divorces, countless broken relationships laid bare in front of him. But there was something about this case that made him pause, even if just slightly. "Are you ready to proceed?" the judge asked, his voice calm but firm. The woman nodded slowly, though the movement felt heavy, like lifting a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and lowered the pen to the paper. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The room, the whispers, even the man's smug expression seemed frozen in place. And then she signed. The scratch of ink against paper was louder than it should have been, echoing through the silence like a final verdict. She finished writing her name, each letter deliberate, each stroke marking the end of something that had once meant everything to her. When she lifted the pen, her hand lingered for a second before pulling away. It was done. Across from her, he let out a quiet chuckle, barely audible but unmistakable. His smirk widened, satisfaction clear in his eyes. To him, this wasn't a loss. It was a victory. He had walked into the courtroom confident, and now he had what he wanted: freedom, control, and, most importantly, the upper hand. Finally, he muttered, shaking his head slightly. That took long enough. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. His tone, his attitude, it wasn't what most expected in a moment like this. There was no sadness, no reflection, no hint of regret. Only arrogance. The woman heard him, of course. How could she not? But she didn't respond. Instead, she placed the pen down carefully and folded her hands in her lap, her gaze still fixed on the table. If she looked at him now, she knew she might break. And she refused to give him that. Her lawyer reached for the papers, organizing them neatly before handing them over to the clerk. Everything was moving forward, just as planned. Just as he had wanted. The judge glanced down at the documents, scanning them briefly. The room remained quiet, the tension lingering in the air like an unspoken question. It should have ended there. That's how these things usually went. Papers signed. Decision finalized. Two people walk away. But something didn't feel finished. The judge's eyes moved back to the woman, then to the man. He studied them for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something beneath the surface. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the bench, a subtle, almost unconscious gesture. The man noticed it and straightened slightly, though the smirk never left his face. "Is there a problem, Your Honor?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with confidence. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and thoughtful. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "No," the judge said finally. "No problem." But his voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise. He picked up the papers again, flipping through them more slowly this time. Page by page, line by line, the sound of the pages turning filled the silence, each movement deliberate. The woman felt her chest tighten. Something was different. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but she could feel it. Across from her, the man shifted again, a hint of impatience creeping into his posture. This wasn't how he had imagined it. This was supposed to be quick, clean, simple. "Your Honor," his lawyer began, stepping forward slightly. "All terms have been agreed upon and signed. There shouldn't be any issues." The judge looked up, his eyes meeting the lawyer's. "I'm aware," he said calmly. Another pause. Then, slowly, the judge placed the papers down on the bench. What happened next would change everything. He stood up. At first, it seemed like a small, almost insignificant movement. Judges stood all the time, for recess, for transitions, for procedural reasons. But this was different. There was no announcement, no explanation. He simply stood. The room shifted instantly. Whispers began to ripple through the gallery, confusion spreading like wildfire. The clerk looked up, clearly unsure. Even the lawyers exchanged puzzled glances. The man's smirk faltered for the first time. "Your Honor," he said, his voice no longer as steady as before. The woman finally looked up. For the first time since entering the courtroom, her eyes left the table and lifted toward the front of the room. Her expression was a mix of confusion and cautious hope, though she didn't dare let herself believe that anything could change. The judge's gaze swept across the room before settling on the man. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer just calm. It carried authority, weight, and something else, something that made the air feel heavier. "Before I finalize this," the judge said slowly, "there is something we need to address." A murmur spread through the room. The man blinked, his confidence cracking just slightly. "Address what?" he asked, trying to keep his tone controlled. The judge didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a file that hadn't been touched until now, a file that sat separate from the neatly arranged divorce papers. He opened it carefully. The sound of the folder opening echoed louder than it should have. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just in the courtroom, but in everything. The woman felt it first. A strange, unfamiliar sensation that crept into her chest, pushing aside the heaviness that had been there for so long. It wasn't relief. Not yet. But it was something. Across from her, the man sat frozen, his eyes locked on the file in the judge's hands. For the first time since this began, he didn't look like a man who had already won. He looked like a man who wasn't sure what was coming next. And that uncertainty was enough to change everything.